Welcome to a new day of truth and awakening. And thank you all for tuning in to another edition of the original histories of Africa and migrations of the ancient world. I'm your King and Royal Majesty, Pharaoh Mizrahim, the ancient historian, historical researcher, geographer, and the voice of truth. And today I will be teaching on the subject, Ethiopian origins of pre-dynastic Egypt. But before we get started, be sure to look below, subscribe to this channel, and like and share this video. Thank you. Concerning the foundations and origins of ancient Egypt, there's a remarkable 2,000-year-old historical source that flat out says who the ancestors and founders of ancient Egypt were. And this source stands out above all because it is the earliest, most valid, and first source to ever give a detailed description on the origins of ancient Egypt. But even more interesting is the overwhelming amount of archaeological evidence that supports this source. But then there are those modern-day authorities, due to their racism and bias, who refuse to accept this source as truth, but declare everything this source says is wrong, but yet bring forth no evidence to prove it wrong, but rather try and refute it with their own feel-good theories based on pure imagination and mere guesses that is just as good as made-up lies. But here on this show, we will waste no time entertaining feel-good theories and made-up opinions, but we will focus only on the original written historical sources and the archaeological evidence that supports it. So without further ado, let's reveal this source, analyze it, examine it, and tell the truth once and for all. No more waiting for the truth. Let us begin our lesson. And about that remarkable 2,000-year-old source, here it is, and it is none other than Diodorus Siculus of Sicily, an ancient Greek historian who lived in the 1st century BCE. And here in Diodorus Siculus, Library of History, Book 3, Year 60 BCE, translated by Charles Henry Oldfather, published in 1935, says in quotes, "Now the Ethiopians, as historians relate, were the first of all men, and the proofs of this statement, they say, are manifest. For they did not come into their land as immigrants from abroad, but were natives of it, and so justly bear the name of autochthonous, is, they maintain, conceded by practically all men." Based on the passage we just read, Diodorus Siculus states on the authority of all ancient historians during his time and before his time, the Ethiopians were the most ancient race of all mankind and first of all men, and their ancestors were not immigrants from a foreign land. And the founders of their civilizations and empires were in fact Ethiopians indigenous to Ethiopia, and this was a settled and established argument agreed upon by Diodorus Siculus and all historians of the ancient world. But let us continue. As we carry on, Diodorus Siculus later in his book 3 states in quotes, "They say also that the Egyptians are colonists sent out by the Ethiopians, Osiris having been the leader of the colony. For speaking generally, what is now Egypt, they maintain, was not land but sea, when in the beginning of the universe was being formed. In the larger part of the customs of the Egyptians are, they hold, Ethiopian, the colonists still preserving their ancient manners." With no other race or nation in the ancient world making the claim to be founders of Egypt, Diodorus Siculus states that the Ethiopians only were the rightful founders of Egypt, and the ancestors of the Egyptians were indeed a colony of Ethiopians. But the question has to be answered: what part of Ethiopia did these founders of Egypt came from? And based on the passage from Diodorus, it is obvious these Ethiopians came from that part of Ethiopia directly south of Egypt that sits in between the first and second cataract of the Nile. and was known to the Egyptians as Taseti, land of the bow, and known today as Lower Nubia or Northern Sudan, and that is the area we will focus on today. But what does the archaeology has to say? That we shall find out now. Let us now bring forth our first ever historical archaeological artifact that shows the truth about the origins and foundations of pre-dynastic Egypt. And that artifact is the one and only Narmer's Palette that was discovered in 1897 by British archaeologist James E. Corbell in the area known as Necken or Hierakonpolis in southern Egypt. And the most significant thing about the Narmer's Palette is it speaks for itself and really needs no interpretation, and that's why honesty is important when dealing with the Narmer's Palette. But let us stay in chronological order as I give an honest interpretation on the Narmer's Palette. And here on the first side of the palette, we see the king Narmer wearing the white crown of the south, and he is shown smiting the enemy and conquering another land and nation of people. And here on the opposite side of the palette, we see the same king Narmer now wearing the red crown of the north, and he is shown marching with his people, the followers of Horus, into their new land. And we also see a coronation taking place where Narmer is now declared the king of the north, being the first king ever to unite the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt being in the south and Lower Egypt being in the north. And this is an irrefutable historical fact. Now that we have already shown and proved that the founder of Egypt was indeed a king from the south who conquered the north according to the Narmer's Palette, we will now focus on the two crowns, the white crown and the red crown that's depicted on the Narmer's Palette. And I will first deal with the white crown. And question is, where did the white crown originate at? And the answer is in the archaeology. And according to the archaeology, the earliest depiction of the white crown was found not in Egypt, but was discovered in Nubia, south of Egypt, in the area known as Kustul, on the archaeological artifact known as the Kustul incense burner that was discovered in 1960 by the Oriental Institute of Chicago and is dated to 3200 BCE. And as we can see, the most ancient depiction of the white crown is clearly shown on the Nubian incense burner. But some scholars have proposed that this incense burner actually depicts an Egyptian king in Nubia, but they provide no evidence to prove this. And what they are attempting to do is confuse pre-dynastic Egypt with Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom Egypt. But this is wrong. And unlike pre-dynastic Egypt, there is written, documented evidence that the Egyptians of the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom did indeed conquer Nubia. But in pre-dynastic Egypt, this was not the case because the first phase of Dynasty 1 had just begun and there was no dynasty before this. So therefore, it would have been impossible for Egypt to have conquered Nubia because there was no Egypt during this time. And there is absolutely no evidence to refute the fact that the white crown originated in Nubia. And being that the white crown represents the south, it makes more sense for it to have originated in Ethiopia or Nubia, because Ethiopia is more to the south than Egypt, or in other words, the real south. And Ethiopia is therefore the true ancestral land of both the white crown and the founders of Egypt, as the Kustul incense burner shows and proves. Let us now move on and focus on our next evidence and artifact, which is an ancient pre-dynastic rock art that was discovered in 1890 at the site known as Nag el Hamdullah, located in the southernmost parts of Egypt in the area of Aswan. And this rock art depicts the earliest representation of a pharaoh wearing the white crown, and it predates the Narmer's Palette. And based on an article posted on scientificamerican.com, it has this to say about the pre-dynastic rock art, and quote, The oldest known representation of a pharaoh are carved on rocks near the Nile River in southern Egypt, researchers report. The carvings were first observed and recorded in the 1890s, but only rediscovered in 2008. In them, a white crowned figure travels in ceremonial processions and on sickle-shaped boats, perhaps representing an early tax collecting tour of Egypt. The scenes place the age of the carvings between 3200 BCE and 3100 BCE. Researchers report in the December issue of the journal Antiquity. During that time, Egypt was transitioning into the dynastic rule of the pharaohs. So based on the article we just read, researchers agree that the depiction on this rock art of a king wearing a white crown predates the First Dynasty. But let's continue. And in that same article, Maria Gatto of Yale University led a team of archaeologists and rediscovered the site at Nag el-Hamdulab in 2008, had this to say, in quotes, "Based on the symbols of power and control in the carvings, Gatto and her colleagues believe the artwork came from the first part of Narmer's reign, before he unified both parts of Egypt. It seems that for Narmer, it was important first to settle the situation in the south, to control the south, and then apparently move to the north. And at that time, he unified Egypt, and we have the First Dynasty," Gatto said. According to what we just read, it is the opinion of Maria Gatto that the king depicted on this rock art at Nag el-Hamdulab is that of Narmer. But Mrs. Gatto provides no evidence to prove that this is actually Narmer. And if this king was really Narmer, then Narmer would have certainly added his name on this rock art just as he did on the Narmer's palette. But the name Narmer is not present. And if we take a close look at the rock art, we can clearly see that this king lived long before Narmer and was certainly an ancestor of Narmer. And some of you may ask the question, why do I say that the crystal incense burner and the rock art at Nag el-Hamdulab predates the Narmer's palette in the First Dynasty? And answer is, when we look at the Narmer's palette and his successors who came after him, we clearly see a surek or hieroglyphic inscription on that object depicting their name and showing who they are. And this was a new thing that came about after the First Dynasty. And this is how we can identify who all the kings were from the First Dynasty all the way to the last 30th Dynasty. But on the crystal incense burner and on the rock art at Nag el-Hamdulab, we see no names of kings. And why is this? Because the crystal incense burner and the rock art at Nag el-Hamdulab depicts the white crown in its most ancient and original form. And this is how we know that the white crown had its origins and beginnings in the most southern region of Nubia. And I will now speak on the red crown. And question is, where did the red crown originate at? And the answer is in the archaeology. And based on the archaeology, the earliest depiction of the red crown was found not in northern Egypt, but was discovered in southern Egypt in the area known as Nakada. And it also must be taken into consideration that the capital of the First and Second Dynasty was also established in southern Egypt. And it's not until later times that we find the capital established at Memphis in northern Egypt. So, being that the earliest depiction of the red crown was found in southern Egypt, and being that the capital of the First Dynasty was also in southern Egypt, proves that the northland of the red crown depicted on the Narmer's palette was actually southern Egypt, and the southland of the white crown depicted on the Narmer's palette was actually Nubia, and proving without a shout of a doubt that the ancestors of Narmer and the founders of the First Dynasties were indeed the wearers of the white crown that originated in Nubia. So there it is. When the evidence is brought forth, the truth comes out. And when the evidence is present, the truth cannot be denied. And truth is the writings of Diodorus Siculus that says the Ethiopians were the founders of Egypt is supported 100% by the archaeology. And some scholars just refuse to put aside their bias and accept this truth for what it is. But regardless of what they say, the history and the archaeology says yes to the fact that a black African race of Ethiopians founded Egypt during a time when Egypt did not exist. And on this, I conclude.
Wow, as we just witnessed, when the evidence is shown, the truth comes out. And liars can only lie when the evidence is not there. But when the evidence is present, the truth cannot be denied. And with that said, what did we learn today? We learned that Egypt was not founded by a race of Caucasian invaders from a foreign land in the Middle East. And neither was it founded by native Egyptians who just sat still in Egypt. But the evidence shows Egypt was founded by a great and powerful race of black African conquerors known as Ethiopians, who came from the south, conquered the north, and created what we know as the first dynasty of Egypt. And after this dynasty arose many other great dynasties that built the great pyramids at Giza and produced the huge and magnificent temples and statues at Karnak and Luxor. None of this would have existed had it not been for these great black Africans who founded Egypt in the first place. This is the true history and origins of Egypt. Everything else is nothing more than just theories and lies. And with that said, I say no more. This is your brother Pharaoh Mitzrayim signing out saying, until next time, Egypt stays in Africa. Peace, Ma'at, Amin, Hotep, and may you all have a wonderful day.